Welcome to The Business. I'm Larry Akinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. In the news this week, Tanzania orders all unregistered bloggers and online forums to suspend their websites or face criminal prosecution. The Democratic Republic of Congo signs its new mining code into law with no changes. Mining firms are threatening legal action. This week's big story is the announcement of a 5,600-kilometer pipeline between Nigeria and Morocco. Is it a game changer or a pipe dream? And in this week's breakdown, what is the value of African football? Europe's top leagues are full of African players, but the continent is missing out on what is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. Joining me throughout for commentary and insight is business reporter Thomas Collins. And in part two, I'll be talking to Eric Osiakwan, managing partner of Chanzo Capital. Bloggers in Tanzania now need a $900 license to publish online. If they continue to operate without one after June 15th, they could face hefty fines and even 12 months in prison. Tom, this is unusual. A license for blogging. What's going on in Tanzania?
Well, this bears all the hallmarks of President John Magufuli, affectionately known as the bulldozer. And what he's trying to do, I think, is clamp down on social dissent to his autocratic rule, which is increasingly developing over the years.
He doesn't like media, does he?
Not at all, no. And a $900 license to blog and kind of protest online is the equivalent of the per capita income for most Tanzanian citizens. So it's clearly unfeasible and clearly an attack at their personal freedom.
What's the bigger picture here? Is he trying to stifle dissent? I mean, it also goes against this narrative that Africa is a digital continent, a digitally connected and upwardly mobile place. Why is he cracking down on this?
Yeah, I think it's a regressive policy, and he is trying to crack down on dissent as he's become more and more autocratic over the years. And if you look towards neighbouring Uganda, where they're also trying to implement attacks on social media, this is perhaps becoming a small trend in these East African countries who are trying to extend their rule and their power.
That's an important point because he's not the only one. There are other African governments that are starting to look at digital content, social media as a potential threat to their political power.
Definitely, yeah, and I think in terms of Museveni, he's been there for God knows how many years, pushing 30, and I think
32 in Uganda.
32, yeah, he's using that as a way to kind of stifle dissent and just to continue his rule.
A license to blog, strange but true. The Democratic Republic of Congo's new mining code has become law, without a single change, despite months of lobbying by big mining companies, including Glencore and Randgold. Tom, this is a story that's been unfolding for quite some time since the start of the year. You've got the government in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most mineral-rich countries in Africa, is hiking royalties on all sorts of minerals. Miners are very unhappy about this. They've asked for their concerns to be addressed. The government is not backing down. They just don't care, do they?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it. Yeah, they met with President Kabila earlier this year to try and protest and say, these hikes and royalties are not fair. And what it is, I think, is the rising cobalt prices and all these kind of natural minerals in Congo's ground, which are gradually gaining price. So kind of the government wants more back from their mining, and that's exactly what they've done by signing this into law.
So objectively, there's an interesting dynamic here because African governments have a history of signing deals with big mining companies that disproportionately favor the mining companies. So just looking at it, you could say, hey, this is entirely legitimate, but there are, of course, big governance concerns, especially in a place like the DRC, which is not known for transparency or good governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd argue it's fair because the new laws were brought in 2002, just after the Congo Civil War, and at that point they were trying to attract investment. But now they have investment and kind of mining companies are really sustained in the DRC. Then what they want to do now is get more back. So I think, all things considered, it's a sensible move.
Sensible move, but it's all about implementation. How is this going to affect investment in the country? I mean, you've got miners saying, we're going to take you to court. They're seeking legal action. There's been all sorts of protests from the miners. Now, they clearly want to get those resources out of the ground. It's big money for them. But is there a risk here that the DRC could shoot itself in the foot?
And that is the concern. Investors are obviously spooked by this. You know, they're standing to lose a sizable portion of their income. But the government and the mining companies really do need each other, so they'll have to find a way which kind of works for both of them, because if not, you know, no one stands to gain.
Thank you, Tom. We haven't heard the last of this one. In this week's big story, we look at Nigeria and Morocco's plans for a 5,600-kilometer gas pipeline across the Sahara. The plan is to complete it in 25 years. Tom, where do we start with this one? They originally announced plans for this project back in 2016. They've now signed an agreement to take things further. Sounds very ambitious, sounds great, sounds like it's never going to happen.
I'll completely agree. There's been plenty of circumstances in Africa where they're suggesting big pipelines between, you know, the north and the south. Algeria, the trans-Saharan pipeline between Algeria and Nigeria was also signed. But the infrastructure gap is huge. The amount of money they need to actually build these things is too much really to kind of overcome. And how will they get the money for these huge projects?
And just to pick up on that, the African Development Bank estimates that the gap, the funding gap for infrastructure is $170 billion a year, which is quite a lot of money. Now, you mentioned the Trans-Saharan pipeline, which is a strikingly similar project. There are plenty of these regional type of infrastructure projects on the books across Africa. None of them have really delivered, but they are quite important. What's going wrong here? What's the issue with, you know, these ambitious projects? Why are they not coming to fruition?
I think simply there's not enough money to kind of put these projects in place, and with the infrastructure gap, like you said, it means they have to front all the money originally. They can't use pre-standing infrastructure, roads, you know, electricity, rail, all these kind of things are hindering. So the investor and the government, when they come to building the projects, will have to build the original infrastructure before they can build what they intend to build.
The frustration, of course, is these projects are really important because Africa only trades 16% of Africa's trade is regional. There's a desperate need for more regional integration. So it's kind of important that we see some of these things happen. Are you optimistic that we might see some more regional infrastructure in the coming years?
Well, I would hope so. And the Continental Free Trade Area, which was signed earlier this year and implemented by the African Union, is kind of the step in the right direction to get regional trade and regional infrastructure off the ground. I mean, that allows 44 African countries to trade amongst themselves, free trade, free investment, you know, bring down all the burdens of the dollars and, you know, changing money across border. So I think it is going in the right direction, but a lot more needs to happen.
Regional infrastructure, easier said than done. This week's breakdown looks at the business of football in Africa. European leagues are filled with African players, including some of the world's biggest stars. Yet the continent remains a marginal player in the multi-billion-dollar industry. Tom, there are 5 African teams that will be hoping for glory in Russia, but it's pretty unlikely that they'll lift the cup because outside of supplying raw talent to European leagues, football in Africa is struggling.
Yeah, and it's kind of a similar story to your raw natural resources. You get the African players, export them to France, you know, all the kind of ex-colonial Portugal, England, where they then become huge stars and earn loads of money. Zinedine Zidane is a classic example, had to choose between his Algerian and French citizenship, and he chose France to play in the French World Cup and the national team, and they won the World Cup at that point. But I think it is a shame that Africa can't keep more of their football players and then get more back from them in that way.
What's the core of the problem here?
I think it's management, and it's in terms of the African actual football associations are kind of riddled with problems, corruption, you know, lack of vision and kind of goals. So if they can really hone their kind of idea and reaffirm the structure, then they may be able to do better.
There is also the issue of poorly governed and corrupt football associations. We've just seen the Ghanaian government announce that it's going to dissolve its football association. Its former head, who was sacked recently under fairly dodgy circumstances, was filmed taking a bribe. That's the tip of the iceberg across Africa.
I think that also seems to be a global phenomenon as well, with FIFA having its own problems. So for some reason, these football associations have vested interests, and it kind of turns into a political model.
I suspect it's not that big of a problem in Germany or Norway, but we're talking about Africa here. Is enough being done to address the management of football on the continent? Because we're talking not just about the passions of the sport and the hopes and dreams of millions of people back home watching. We're talking about business here. This is a missed opportunity economically for African countries.
And I think the management teams, that, like you say, they need to get better structured and better management, but they also need to try and encourage their players to stay in the countries where they're from and kind of give more back to those countries as opposed to getting citizenship elsewhere.
Who's your pick for the World Cup? Which African team are you rooting for, and how far do you think they'll go?
Well, I'm a big fan of Egypt. I like Mo Salah. I've been there many times, and I think
there are a few people who don't.
Yeah, he is the poster boy for this World Cup, or maybe not the poster boy, but the one I think who could cause some surprises. Unluckily, he's injured at the moment, which kind of I shoot myself in the foot by that choice.
Thank you very much, Tom, for joining me on The Business today. Join me in part 2 when I'll be talking to Eric Osiakwan, Managing Partner of Chanzo Capital. Welcome back to The Business, the show where we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. I'm Lanre Akinola. I'm delighted to be joined by Eric Osiakwan, Managing Partner of Chanzo Capital. Eric, tech in Africa is making headlines globally. It's attracting money globally. Why is this an exciting time to be a tech entrepreneur on the continent?
Thank you. So what is very interesting is that 2 decades ago, Africa decided to leapfrog into the information age, and we went straight to mobile. To the extent that in '98, there were more landlines in Manhattan than the whole of Africa. By 2008, there were more cell phones in Africa than the whole of the United States. And this kick-started a tech revolution. And in 2008, I was part of a team that built the first submarine cable to connect East Africa to the rest of the world. And so those submarine...
Is that CCOM, right?
That was Teams. That was Teams before CCOM, but CCOM came right after Teams. Right. And those submarine cables then brought broadband to the continent, and those broadband connected to the cell phones. And suddenly, Africans began to experience the internet purely through their cell phone. So in Africa, the cell phone is the device of access. And the cell phone has been the prerequisite of the youthful population in Africa. The youth have jumped on it. And suddenly we began to see entrepreneurs, young Africans, begin to develop technology using their cell phones and begin to address challenges within their communities. And this is a very strong paradigm shift, because when I was going to school, the in thing was finish school, get a job, or leave the continent. Today, it's a cool thing to be a startup CEO in the tech space. Like, a lot of young guys just pride in being entrepreneurs and starting their own business and realizing their vision. And I think that's a very strong paradigm shift that we've seen just in the last 2 decades because of the availability of mobile and the fact that there's an entrepreneurial spirit within the young Africans that they want to express. And as you said, this has ignited a lot of investment and attention across not only the continent, but globally. Even to the extent that Silicon Valley investors are beginning to invest in Africa. So this is a very important phenomenon, and I believe that this phenomenon is backed by certain facts. One of them is the returns on mobile. So if you invested, a study that was done by Freshfields that looked at the impact, the returns on telecom, media, and technology companies on 40 stock exchanges across Africa. The annualized return over a decade was 19%. In other words, if you invested in MTN, you made 19% annualized return, which is higher than oil and gas, which is 6%. So actually, the tech sector has been given the biggest returns commensurate to investment.
Okay, but MTN is the South African mobile operator.
Right.
We know about the mobile story in Africa has been one of the big global success stories recently. Right. Mobile money has become an international story out of Kenya. But mobile operators don't represent the tech entrepreneurship space. I mean, it's a relatively old-fashioned business, even though it is on mobile. Give us a bit of a sense of what the environment looks like, because yes, there has been a paradigm shift, but it's still a difficult operating environment for your average tech entrepreneur, because just as any business is hamstrung by lack of power, lack of infrastructure, et cetera, that will apply even more so if you're a young person trying to make it happen in tech.
Absolutely. But what this young generation is doing is building on the success of the mobile generation, right? So these guys build the mobile networks. They're like, we are not going to bring the creativity on top of it. So for me, we're in the second phase. We've kind of moved to gear 2. Gear 1 was connectivity. So mobile, submarine cable. Gear 2 is now creativity. So these guys are beginning to realize that actually I can build the next Facebook. I mean, imagine a young African who lives in a place that, like you said, there's no power and it's hard to even get access to broadband connectivity, to even dream they can build the next Facebook. I'll give you an example. One of the companies I'm invested in was two guys from out of college here in UST in 2005. And this guy decided he wanted to build a mobile value-added service company in Ghana and reached out to me to be an advisor. And for me, these were two guys out of college. They believed in themselves that they could build a business. The company turned cash positive in the second year and went profitable in the third year. And the company's been growing between 26 and 34% year on year. Today, the company is on track to make 20 million US. And we are now in 4 countries. We're in Ghana, we're in Nigeria, we're in Kenya, and we're in Cameroon. Now, this is an example of a young Ghanaian entrepreneurs who believed in themselves and beyond all odds that you mentioned, have been able to build a company on the back of the mobile operators.
But aren't these the exception rather than the rule? Isn't this what makes the entrepreneurial story so appealing, is that it's against the odds, you're defying the odds. But that means for every one of those success stories, there are many that failed. Many that have failed.
And it's the same in Silicon Valley, it's everywhere in the world as well, and even in London, right? We hear the success stories of a few, but many failed. But the fact that a few succeed gives hope and gives a certain sense of, I can do it too if I try. So it's important for us to highlight the success stories, but yes, create a better environment for those that have failed to succeed. So for example, we do a lot to try and bring the various actors within the ecosystem. So making sure that government is engaged, making sure that the academic institutions and research organizations are able to provide the R&D that is needed to power these entrepreneurs, making sure that civil society is there as a market and can provide the opportunity for these entrepreneurs. Even the cultural change where Africans begin to value what is built in Africa.
But that's very different from your traditional VC's role. I mean, your traditional VC looks at your spreadsheet, looks at your earnings potential, and that's kind of it. So do you need a different kind of attitude if you're moving into African tech at this time? It sounds like you need to think a little bit bigger. Maybe you need to operate in a slightly different way.
So this is why chances were different, and this is why I decided to build this firm. So I started as an entrepreneur. I built a bunch of companies and succeeded in some of them. And I realized that there was an opportunity for me to build a different kind of VC that fits Africans' model. The Silicon Valley model is different. The London model is different. The Asian model is different. Africa's model is going to be different. And it speaks to the fact that, like you said, you have to be a little bit more, you have to think a little bit more broadly, and you have to be more inclusive and figure out how you can work with various actors to create the right environment for success. Because if you don't create the environment, you will lack the ability to have very successful entrepreneurs. And this game is all about success, right? You have to be able to build product that succeed in the marketplace. You have to be able to then build companies that become big and they grow and they cover the continent. So we really believe that it's an opportunity where we can take entrepreneurs from one country and grow them into Africa.
So just to pick up on that point, start in one country, grow them into Africa. We talk of tech in Africa. The reality is when you look at the numbers, there are 3 countries that completely dominate. It's South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. Right. They attract something like more than 3/4 of all funding that goes into tech in Africa. So when we're talking about tech on the continent, it's not really an Africa story yet, is it? It's driven by certain markets. What needs to happen for this to become a truly Pan-African story?
You're right that certain countries are leading, and actually I add 2 more countries to that, which is I add Ivory Coast and Ghana, which makes the King's countries. So our fund is actually called the King's Fund, which is that we decided that can we take 5 countries that are really leading this pack? And we added Ivory Coast because half of Africa is Francophone, so you cannot ignore that entire market, right? And Ghana, to that extent, we believe is also very strong in a mix of that. And we actually have a criteria that we use, which we can talk about later. But I think that having these 5 countries, they set a certain benchmark for the others to follow. And so it's not exclusionary. It's more saying that these guys are really doing so well. You must try to be in the A team. And I believe that other countries like Rwanda, Senegal, Cameroon, Uganda, a few other countries are really inching up. And I think that's what we should aspire, that all countries will start seeing this as an opportunity to get up to that level. But yes, certain countries are leading the pack.
What excites you about tech in Africa? Where do you see the real opportunities? What are the sectors that are really going to drive the tech entrepreneurship space in the next few years? Because we've spoken a little bit about Andela, which is a development company. Yeah. There was a recent investment by TPG, which is a big a US private equity company into fintech. Fintech seems to be quite exciting. There's been a lot on retail. It feels like we might be moving into another phase here. What are the sectors, what are the niches that you're looking at where you think the next big thing is going to come from?
So if you take the fintech space, right, I agree with you that we are in what I call the second generation innovation. I'll give you an example on an investment that we made last year. So this company is based in Kenya.
We've got 1 minute left. So.
Okay, so this company basically on the back of mobile money is built an algorithm that is able to generate a credit score, and on the back of the credit score, they provide lending. Now, this is a very big problem in Africa where people don't have a credit history, so you can't provide lending. Now, they've been able to figure out how to build this using mobile money and your mobile phone activity, and the company was making 98% repayment. And that's why we invested. And this entrepreneur was a 26-year-old guy, and this was his third startup in Kenya. So this is somebody that you kind of, you have to support this entrepreneur, because being able to figure out how to build such a system is just incredible.
Now, you're obviously excited about tech in Africa. Very quickly, what needs to happen in the next few years to make sure that the continent doesn't just build on this momentum, but really gets the full value out of the potential that's out there?
I think that successful Africans need to reinvest in the young generation. And this is what I'm doing. I believe that the way societies grow is that those that have gone ahead do not only invest their capital, but their experience and help the next generation. So the generation that's ahead should look back and give back and help bring the other generation up so they can do better than us.
Well, there's no better way to do it than to lead by example. Eric Osiakwan, thank you so much for joining me on The Business today.
It's a pleasure.
That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching The Business, and please join us again next time.